All right, welcome everybody, both panelists and attendees, to the second day of the RASC GA Lite. Thank you very much for joining us. Before we get going, we just want to recognize that we're operating from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. We have a very packed schedule today, so I'm actually just going to pass it over to our first group of presenters, Chris, Randall, and Peter, who I think is still joining us, but should be here soon. So I'll yield the floor to all of you, and thank you very much for being here.
Great, and thank you very much, Matthew. And again, I want to thank all of you for doing this. And what I'm going to do is, there we go. It's about to work. So I'm going to start the slides. The format we're going to have is that the three presenters will present sequentially, and I'll try to limit that to 15 minutes, and then we'll throw the webinar open so that all of us can take part. So not just the three of us, but also the people listening. You can send questions. Let's see, I shall now start. Will this work? Yes, terrific. So here's our typical person asking, what's the point of the history of astronomy? Why should I care? What's it to me? Fine enough. And here's our three presenters. That's a venerable artifact of the RASC, and I won't say anything more about it at the moment. That's Peter Broughton, who's perhaps the best historian of the RASC. And the only other thing I'll say is that among all the important things Peter has done, he's written the best biography, it's a recent biography, the best biography of a Canadian astrophysicist. That's Northern Star about J.S. Plaskett. Oops, go up again. And that is Chris Gainor, who everyone should know. Chris is a distinguished historian of space, and he's written about space-related things, such as how the NASA program and the Apollo program benefited from the shutting down of the Avro Arrow, unfortunately. Chris is presently engaged in finishing a book on the Hubble Space Telescope during its mission up to the present, and that's being published by NASA. So we'll look forward to that. So the history of astronomy is written in the stars. Its past lives in the present. It's integral to how we do astronomy now. And so here's some examples. Star names, these go way back. Some of them go back to Greco-Roman antiquity. And here's a 17th century example. This is from the original Uranometria, and there's Sirius underlined there. Star catalogs. Here's the first edition of Messier's catalog. We still use these numerical designations. And if you're a professional or astronomer, you still use these. Optical systems. Here's a drawing from Newton's lifetime of the first one of the early Newtonian telescopes. That design is still used today. And here we've got one by Norman Fulham. That instrument is in the Dorner Telescope Museum of the RASC. So we still use these. Finally, plurality of worlds astrobiology. There's an image on the left of what's probably the most famous early modern discussion of life on other worlds, astrobiology, by Fontenelle. Many of the same questions he raised in 1686 still animate the present astrobiology programs of places like NASA, which is sort of cool. So clearly the astronomical past matters to the astronomical present. And we should all consider that it's a vast resource which can lend cultural depth when any of us do education and public outreach, and many of us do that. So let's go right up to the present, toppling statues. There's a lot of that going on at the moment. We've always done it. Toppling statues is part of history. In fact, here's a very nice illustration of the ancestors of the people who are now complaining about toppling statues doing it. These are American revolutionaries taking down the statue of George III. Who knew? Interesting, eh? Statues are data for histories, but they're not histories. Statuary is superb for telling unnuanced, one-sided accounts. The medium of statuary has rarely been an effective vehicle for presenting balanced accounts. And it's just something we have to admit. So what about astronomy? How does this matter? Astronomy can't escape examination here. From 1605 to 1923, professional astronomy in Canada was a practical astronomy of survey and mapping, astronomy in the service of empire. The Dominion Land Survey was a factor. It was an irritant in the Red River Rebellion and the Northwest Rebellion. The prime scientific movers of the Dominion Observatory were land surveyors, Deville, King, and Klotz. Serious institutional astrophysics, the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory, for instance, evolved out of the Dominion Observatory. Therefore, there's a continuous line of descent in Canada from colonial astronomy in the service of empire to modern astrophysics. However, and I put a personal note here, I have great respect for the integrity, determination, ingenuity, and craft of astronomers from the 17th and 19th centuries, while at the same time, I have to recognize they're in the service of a wider purpose, which I don't respect. That's it, building of empire. We cannot dodge this conversation because it will find us anyway. I have no ready answers, but recent events show that history matters to Black Lives Matter, and that matters to all of us, or should. And we owe it to ourselves, our predecessors, and our future to listen, look, and learn to get it right. And that's the end of my what's it? So I'm going to stop the share. And I see we still haven't got Chris. Chris, do you want to go next? And if Peter doesn't show up, I can do his.
Okay. Let me see, just a second here. So I certainly endorse everything that Randall just said, and I want to just speak briefly about a couple of things I'm working on right now, which and some of the questions that we as historians deal with. Right now, I'm writing a bit of a chapter from a Canadian astronomy, which is how did space astronomy begin in Canada? And as you can see from the slide here, it got its start with a couple of ideas that really did not get off the ground. The Canadian Space Telescope, or CST, which was advanced by a group of astronomers in the late 1970s, and then that fell by the wayside, and then up came Starlab, which would have flown on the shuttle or spacecraft deployed from the shuttle, and it would have involved the United States almost inevitably because of the shuttle, but also Australia. And both of these craft were going to do a lot of observations in the ultraviolet. So anyway, the Starlab expired in 1984 officially because the Canadian government was not willing to pay the Canadian share of it. And although I've been digging up some other reasons, basically all three sides, there were questions on all three participants in this thing. So anyway, there were other space telescopes that have flown that do take some of their lineage from Starlab, and also Canadians moved on to other things. A lot of them have worked on Hubble and various other programs. Of course, Canada is a participant in JWST and FUSE. And Gordon Walker, who is the prime mover behind the Canadian Space Telescope, of course, has kind of gone on to fame as one of the people who basically created some of the technologies needed to find exoplanets. Okay, next slide, please. But another reason why I'm looking into this is because history repeats itself. There's the famous quote that everybody loves to use all the time about that. And so right now, a group of astronomers in Canada are proposing Castor. And we even had a contest in the RASC to come up with a patch for it. Castor is in many ways similar to the CST. It's operating mainly in the ultraviolet, And the idea is roughly the same. It's to complement Hubble, which is probably the biggest telescope involved in ultraviolet astronomy, but nobody's kind of done a survey of the skies. Hubble has a very narrow field of view. So here we are back again, and unfortunately, it kind of looks like Castor is headed for the same fate as its predecessors. The Canadian government doesn't seem to be interested in spending the money on it. So anyway, there's that. Next slide, please. And I just want to talk briefly about, next slide, please, about some of the work I'm doing with on the Hubble book, which should be out later this year. And just answering a lot of questions. You know, everybody, certainly astronomers generally know that the history around the Hubble telescope, its main mirror being ground to the wrong shape. Not many people know why, although lots of people have theories. And of course, it's a complicated story, as these things often are, so I've dug into that. Just before this talk, we're talking about what does Hubble have to do with the internet. I'm going to talk about that. And how does it influence amateur astronomers when they process their own astrophotos? There's a little known chapter in Hubble where amateur astronomers were given observing time on it. And although that's no longer the case, everyone who wants has access to Hubble data. And so if you want to process Hubble data, you can, if you have the time to invest into it. So these are some of the things that I'm looking into as a historian. I'm going to pass it back to Randall.
There we go. Thanks, Chris. And next is Peter. Peter, you should unmute yourself.
So I have 5 very basic slides outlining some points that I thought were relevant. And what I thought was, it's best if you just read them at your own pace. I won't read what says on the slide. The first gives some ideas of why I think history is important. So whenever we try to understand a topic, or even to write about it, asking questions should be top of mind. We've all learned to ask when, where, who, and what, but probably the most important is to ask why. And on the second slide, you'll see some reasons. Trying to answer a why question is usually the most difficult, but at the same time most rewarding. Different people at different times in history give different answers to questions. The next slide, please. Here's an example. So this is where real history departs from a mere recital of facts. And the next slide, I'm showing that how really it isn't history if you don't ask why. And I've given some examples here which you can take a few minutes to read. Okay, I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm certainly not a historian. I really hated the subject in school. Whatever I've learned over the years. Other than asking why, I thought I'd conclude with a strategy to use when researching any topic. And basically the idea is start with the most general source of information and proceed to more specialized sources as you proceed with your research. That's all I have to say. I sure hope there's some time left for discussion.
Let's see here. So, anyone have any questions?
So we had, see, actually I had one. So Randall, you were talking about earlier, one of the things you mentioned was astronomy in the service of empire. And I was wondering if you could give that a little bit more context. How is that like we're thinking then in terms of astronomy being used to ill will? Like how does that actually happen?
Well, it happens in a number of ways. A lot of what we look at as the direct ancestor of modern astronomy. So these are the people who seek advice and are supported by institutions like the Paris Observatory, state-run institutions, or the Greenwich Observatory. A lot of that, so European-style astronomy that happened here in the colonial period, happened in the colonial period, and a lot of the ultimate goals of that sort of astronomy was mapping out the colonial possessions. That was even involved with things that at first sight seemed to be pure science, like the transits of Venus. Again, it was part of mapping the empire. And that's, so just the very fact that people are going out, dividing the land, renaming it, and find astronomy was there in one way or another. And or great fantastic projects such as the Atlantic Neptune to come up with a good map of the coasts of North America. Ultimately for the British Navy, astronomy was involved, and one of the earliest Canadian observatories was in the south of Nova Scotia, and it was to serve that project. It was a very well-equipped observatory too. I cannot speak for the RASC, obviously. I can only speak for myself. I'm fascinated by what those astronomers did. I admire their ingenuity. I admire the skill with which they carried out the observations. So I've got this quandary. I've got this problem that I don't like empire. I don't like what it does to people. I don't like how it takes resources from one people and to various degrees may enslave them for economic gain. But at the same time, I'm really fascinated and interested by the people who did the astronomy back then. So what do? This is a big conversation we've got to have, not just us internally, but with other players, with other bits of the social fabric in Canada and elsewhere.
Yeah, agreed.
And we should probably be liaising with Casca for that. But anyways, I'll shut up now.
No, okay. Thank you, Randall. Question from Jennifer. This is to Peter. Which one of those links would give us more information about the Catholic priest in 1646? I would like more answers to those whys.
Okay. If you find an article that I wrote in the journal on 17th century astronomy in Canada, I think it was in 1979, that would be, I mean, I know that's a place you could find more about Bressani, but if it was a new topic that you were trying to investigate, then I would say read the Canadian Encyclopedia, see if there's anything in there about Bressani. And the next thing would be go to the Dictionary of Canadian Biography and read the article about Bressani there. Then Richard Jarrell's book, of course, on Canadian astronomy. And gradually you zoom in on more particular sources of information. And then if you are lucky enough to be able to find original documents from the 17th century, then you may find out more about Bressani that nobody recently has remembered.
And I should just add, there's a new paper on Bressani in one of the recent RASCs this year. I forget which one. Jennifer, if you can send me an email, I'll send you direct links to Peter's paper and that new one.
If there's time and nobody's waiting, I can ask Chris a question or two.
Actually, there's one in here that I wanted to ask. I thought it was pretty interesting. This is from Ken Jackson. And it's in the chat feed. And it said, how did other cultures like India or China follow a different path with the history of astronomy? I'm sure that could be a PhD thesis, but maybe in just a few minutes.
Is that for me to try to answer?
I don't know. I figured I would put it out there to any of the panelists who want to jump in on that one. Could be a group effort.
Yeah. Well, the big problem with other cultures, as far as I'm concerned, is that I don't read anything except English and French. So if I really want to understand Chinese or Indian or Islamic astronomy, I have to be able to read their language, which unfortunately I can't do. But there are English-speaking authors who have studied these other cultures and astronomies, and if you don't mind the bias that an English-speaking author would put on in interpreting these other cultures, then, for instance, Richard Needham written multi-volume work on Chinese astronomy. I don't know whether anybody else has anything intelligent to say.
Well, I have a couple of comments. Actually, I haven't really researched astronomy in other cultures, but I've certainly come across it in my life, and you know, there's a lot of kind of cross-pollination of ideas. You know, for example, when Europe was in what are kind of misleadingly called the Dark Ages of the medieval period, it was not a good time for scientific inquiry, shall we say, in Europe. And that was a time when astronomy in the Arab world was flourishing. And it had a huge impact even today. A lot of the star names we use are Arabic names from that period. And there was a lot of thought. And I think some of astronomy in various parts of the world often has similar roots. The first thought that came into my head when that question came up was once when I was in India and I was in Jaipur and visited the great observatory that was built there several hundred years ago. It is very sophisticated for its time, but like a lot of other astronomical facilities back then in the before there were telescopes around, they were using it to determine time and the seasons and things like that in a similar way to us. And you find that in a lot of other places. Also, sometimes trying to predict what's going to happen in the future. You know, astrology has, whether we like it or not, has a long relationship with astronomy and in various cultures as well. So, so there's differences and there's also similarities. And, you know, I think one thing that's really exciting in astronomy in Canada right now, and I suppose around North America, is all the research that's going into work on what the First Nations have done through their history. There's been a lot of information coming up, a lot of it generated by First Nations people themselves. You know, I know Dave Chapman, who's very well known around the RASC, is working a lot with Mi'kmaq people. So that's what I have to say.
Yeah, and I know that like some even contemporary astronomical discoveries have been made by looking back at old observations. So one example I could think of off the top of my head is like the understanding that the Crab Nebula was actually a supernova explosion that had been recorded by Chinese astronomers
That's
like
right.
centuries ago. And when we took those notes and we were able to take a telescope and point it to that part of the sky and say, oh, that's the remnant of this supernova. So actually be able to have a dialogue with astronomers from centuries ago, which is astonishing when you think about it. Cool. Okay. Chris, Randall, and Peter, thank you so very much for that presentation.